Welcome everyone to this CIC lecture. It's my great pleasure today to introduce my colleague Cherie, who is going to give the talk today. So Dr. Cherie Strikwerda-Brown completed a master's in clinical neuropsychology at the University of Melbourne, followed by a PhD in psychology at the University of Sydney, Australia. She is currently a postdoc fellow in the lab of Dr. Sylvia Villeneuve at the Douglas Research Center. Broadly, her work combines clinical neuropsychology and neuroimaging to delineate the neurobiological underpinnings of cognitive and emotional processes in order to better understand neurodegenerative diseases. Her current research focuses on determining psychological risk and protective factors for Alzheimer's disease and their neural mechanism. So yeah, it's my great pleasure to introduce Cherie, who I'm quite biased, but she's an amazing speaker. So it's going to be a treat for everyone. As a reminder, keep your microphone muted during the talk so that the talk can go smoothly. And you can raise your hand if you want to ask your question out loud, and I'll find a moment to gently interrupt Cherie to ask your question. Or otherwise, you can also ask your questions in the chat, and I'll be happy to ask the question for you. So Cherie, take it away.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks very much for the introduction and for the invitation and opportunity to present my work today. I'm quite excited to share with you some of the work that I've been doing as part of my postdoc with Dr. Sylvia Villeneuve over the past kind of year and a half or so, looking at this idea of whether the way that we can think might affect our risk of dementia. So all of this work that I'm presenting today is as of yet unpublished, so I would welcome any input or feedback that you might have. So this idea that our mental and physical health might inherently be intertwined is certainly not a new one. Actually, until about 300 years ago, this was the commonly accepted dogma that our mind and our body are connected. But since about the 17th century, with the advent of modern Western medicine, the mind and the body have increasingly been considered separately. It hasn't really been until recent years that this connection has been re-recognised. And this is partly stemmed from observations such as the fact that, okay, there we go. Such as the observation that emotional stress is actually one of the major contributing factors to several of the leading causes of death in modern society. And stress is also estimated to account for up to 75% of all visits to doctors. So certainly not an insignificant factor. So this idea that psychological factors can impact upon disease is also being increasingly recognised in terms of Alzheimer's disease. So it's been determined that increasing levels of depression, anxiety and stress, along with certain personality traits like high levels of neuroticism and low levels of conscientiousness, are associated with increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so there are a couple of important points to highlight in relation to this research. So firstly, if we look at these associations across the lifespan, what's apparent is that increasing levels of these psychological factors as far back as early adulthood and even adolescence are associated with increased risk for Alzheimer's disease later in life. So what this suggests is that these psychological factors don't just represent perhaps an early symptom of the disease, but they might also be an early risk factor for the disease. What's also important is that these psychological factors don't tend to receive as much attention as other modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, but it's been observed that psychological factors can have at least a strong, sometimes even stronger relationship with cognitive decline when we compare them to other more commonly studied lifestyle and clinical factors like diabetes or smoking. So now we've seen that these kind of negative psychological factors might increase our risk for Alzheimer's disease. We also wondered, well, is it possible to reduce your risk by perhaps adopting a more positive mindset? And so the Preliminary evidence around this question suggests that perhaps yes. People with a stronger purpose in life, or those that display higher levels of optimism or practice mindfulness, are shown to have better cognitive performance, particularly in older individuals, or less cognitive decline over time as well. But this research here, it's still kind of in its infancy, and this particularly pertains to the relationship between these factors and risk for Alzheimer's disease. So therefore, when we consider the relationship between psychological factors and AD risk, there still are a number of outstanding questions that I hope to kind of broadly cover with my presentation today and the couple of projects that I'll be presenting. So firstly, well, are these positive psychological factors related to risk for Alzheimer's disease? And secondly, how might these perhaps interact with the more negative psychological risk factors like depression or anxiety and neuroticism, since we would expect that positive and negative factors would be related? And finally, how is it that these factors perhaps influence risk for Alzheimer's disease? So what are the potential mechanisms that might underlie these relationships? And so specifically, I'll be talking about two different projects. The first one will be looking at the association between mindfulness and early markers of Alzheimer's disease. And the second one will be looking at associations between a range of different psychological factors and cognitive resilience to Alzheimer's disease pathology. So this is an idea that I'll introduce you to in the second part of the talk. Okay, but to start, we're going to talk a little bit about mindfulness. So as many of you would be aware, mindfulness has started to become quite a buzzword in recent years. But how it's been defined by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's considered the kind of modern day guru of mindfulness, is the ability to engage in non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. So to break this down a little bit, it's really talking about kind of consciously paying deliberate attention to what's happening right now without adding any additional judgments or labels onto the experience. So this is something that I think the dog in the picture here is demonstrating quite nicely. So one of the reasons why mindfulness has been gaining a lot of popularity recently is it's been associated with a range of different benefits to both mental as well as physical health. And these benefits have been demonstrated for both the formal practice of mindfulness, so perhaps engaging in mindfulness meditation, for example, as well as for mindfulness as a trait, so one's tendency to be mindful in daily life. So for example, mindfulness has been associated with reduced anxiety, reduced stress, better sleep, reduced pain and depression, improved cardiovascular health, and even perhaps helping us navigate through this seemingly never-ending pandemic. So these benefits of mindfulness have also been shown to extend to brain health, with mindfulness being associated with changes in the structure and the function of various brain regions, including those that are involved in self-awareness, like the default mode network, as well as regions that have been implicated in emotional regulation and attentional control. And this is quite consistent with the definition of mindfulness. What's most important is that these benefits to brain health have been also shown to have kind of functional implications as well. So people that practice mindfulness have been shown to have better cognitive performance, and this is particularly the case for older individuals. So just to recap then, we've seen that mindfulness is associated with improvements in brain health, as well as reductions in commonly known risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, like sleep, cardiovascular health, and depression. We also know that certain psychological traits, such as aspects of our personality, can influence the development of Alzheimer's disease. So therefore, we wondered whether the trait of mindfulness might also have a protective effect on Alzheimer's disease. And so when we consider how to address this question, something that's important to keep in mind is that the pathological changes associated with Alzheimer's disease, so the deposition of amyloid and tau pathologies in the brain, can start to begin up to several decades before the onset of the cognitive and functional decline that result in the eventual clinical diagnosis of dementia. So this provides us with a particular stage that we call preclinical Alzheimer's disease, in which individuals are cognitively normal but have quite significant levels of Alzheimer's disease pathology in the brain. So what this provides us with is this window of opportunity in which we can study the psychological factors associated with the earlier stages of the disease without the potential confounding effects of cognitive impairment or advanced, potentially irreversible neurodegeneration that comes with later stages of the disease. So then the aim for this study was to explore how the trait of mindfulness relates to cognitive and pathological markers of Alzheimer's disease in this earliest preclinical phase of the disease. So for this, we took 261 participants from the Prevent AD longitudinal observational cohort study run out of the Douglas Centre that some of you might be aware of. So these individuals, they are completely cognitively normal at enrolment into the study, but they're at increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease dementia due to their family history of the disease. And so a subset of these participants completed amyloid and tau PET scanning, which allows us to quantify the amount and the spatial distribution of these two key pathological hallmarks of AD in the brain. And so importantly, the 261 individuals in which we studied the early cognitive markers of AD and the 124 subsample of participants that completed the PET scanning in which we studied the early pathological markers of AD, these two samples were well matched in terms of their general clinical and demographic information. So all of the participants completed the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire. So this is a self-report measure which captures the trait of mindfulness, so one's tendency to be mindful in everyday life. And this produces 5 different subscales which capture different aspects of mindfulness. All of the participants also completed the RBANS cognitive assessment task over a number of longitudinal time points. So this included up to 7 annual years of follow-up. And from the RBANS, we can extract various cognitive index scores for different cognitive domains, as well as an overall measure of global cognition. Finally, for the subset of individuals that underwent amyloid and tau PET scans, we calculated standardized uptake values for key brain regions of interest that we know to accumulate amyloid and tau pathology early in the disease course. So in terms of the analysis, we decided to use multivariate partial least squares. This form of analysis is quite useful when you have multiple different independent variables as well as multiple dependent variables, because it allows you to elicit combinations of these variables that are maximally correlated with one another. So for this study, we performed 3 separate PLS analyses, looking at the multivariate relationship between the 5 mindfulness subscales as our independent variables. And then firstly, the longitudinal slope scores for each of the cognitive indexes, which we calculated using linear mixed effect models in order to determine cognitive change over time in each of the cognitive domains. For the second PLS, the dependent variables were the 38 values for amyloid across the brain. And for the third PLS, the dependent variables were the tau values for the 14 regions of interest. So just to give a very kind of broad overview of what is involved in the PLS analysis, So essentially, we start with two matrices. The first one contains our independent variables. So in this case, this is the 5 mindfulness subscale scores in each of the columns, with each row representing a single participant. Then the second matrix contains our dependent variables. So for the first PLS, this is the 6 cognitive slopes for the 6 cognitive index scores. The second matrix, the second PLS will involve the amyloid values, and the third, the tau values. So what we do is we multiply these or correlate these two matrices together, which provides us with a correlation matrix, which we then use singular value decomposition in order to decompose the correlation matrix into underlying latent variables, which represent the multivariate relationship. So for each of these latent variables, this produces a singular value, which demonstrates the covariance between the two original matrices, as well as vectors of weights for each of the independent and the dependent variables, which show us how much these variables are each contributing to the multivariate relationship. Okay, so what did we find? Well, here we're seeing the results from the first PLS analysis, looking at the relationship between mindfulness and cognitive decline. So just to orient you, on the left are the contributions of each of the mindfulness subscales to the multivariate relationship, and on the right are the contributions of each of the cognitive index scores. And the variables that are shown in bold are those that significantly contributed to the multivariate relationship. So what we found was that high levels of mindful non-judgment, describing, and non-reactivity were associated with less cognitive decline on measures of attention, global cognition, and immediate and delayed memory. So in order to kind of better visualize this relationship, we took the variables that were most significantly contributing to this multivariate relationship and we plotted them against each other. So we took the scores on the mindful non-judgment subscale, which was the strongest contributing mindfulness facet, and we divided participants into tertiles based on their scores on the mindful non-judgment scale. Then we plotted each of these groups in terms of their scores on the global cognitive index as well as the attention index over the up to 84 months of follow-up visits. So what's quite apparent is that the group which reported displaying high levels of mindful non-judgment, so that's shown in the purple, show a relative stability or even slight increase in their cognitive performance over time, whereas the other two groups are showing quite a clear decline in cognition. So in terms of the second PLS analysis, looking at the relationship between mindfulness and amyloid, again, on the left are the various mindfulness subscales, and on the right are the different brain regions and their contribution to the relationship with mindfulness. So here, the brain regions that were significantly contributing are shown in the darker colours, the orange and red. So what we found here was that high levels of mindful non-judgment and non-reactivity were associated with less amyloid signal in the bilateral temporal parietal and frontal cortices. And for tau, we found high levels of mindful acting with awareness, describing, non-judgment and non-reactivity were associated with less tau PET signal in the bilateral medial and lateral temporal regions. So this included the entorhinal cortex and amygdala, as well as extending into more lateral regions like the inferior temporal lobe.
Oh, Cherie?
Yeah.
We have a question from Malach.
Okay.
I mean, this is a really cool result right here. That's really amazing that you have that relationship. Really striking finding. We just landed here, so I'm talking about it. But if you could go back a slide, yeah, here. Could you put this in context for me a bit? Because what does here you're looking at like a 5-point drop in the R bands, right? Or in subdomains of the R bands. Could you put that in context for me? Like, what does that like materially mean for the for the individual, or I mean, or conversely, is this showing that it is kind of a sensitive proxy for future decline, if you will?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the R bands, for those of you who aren't familiar, has a mean score of 100 and then a standard deviation of 10. So a change of 5 points would still be considered within the normal range of cognitive performance for this age group. But I think the trend is what's kind of more important, is that it's tending to show that steady decline over time. These individuals are still considered cognitively normal, so we wouldn't necessarily expect their scores to be at the abnormal level quite yet, but we are more interested in these more kind of subtle markers of this early change that we're starting to see that might, I guess, predict or indicate later kind of continued progression.
Yeah, and can you remind me, when did you conduct the mindfulness testing relative to this timeline?
Yeah, so it becomes a bit complex because the participants were all kind of enrolled in the Prevent AD study in different years, whereas the mindfulness questionnaire was administered around 2018. So depending on the participant and when they actually started in the study, it could have been, done at the first visit, it could have been done after 12 months. It was kind of scattered throughout the time visits, but we did control for that time between the cognitive testing and the mindfulness questionnaire, and the results were still significant. So we also tried to centre the kind of relationships, like based on when they did the mindfulness questionnaire in relation to the cognition, but it all ends up being a little bit messy. So I think the fact that we control for time between and the results were still there suggests that, kind of regardless of when it's done, you're still seeing this relationship. But I think to more confidently determine things like the directionality of the relationship, we would perhaps, in future work, it would be important to be administering the questionnaire and the cognitive assessments at the same time points for every participant.
Great, thank you so much.
Cherie, while we're here, we have another question from Olivier asking if you could tell us more about what non-judgment means.
Yeah, sure. So this is the mindfulness subscale that came out as really quite significant across all of our analyses. So it seems to be the one that is most important in relation to Alzheimer's disease markers. So it really refers to not kind of putting any judgments in particularly the thoughts and feelings that you're having. So, most of us, I think, if we, start to feel a bit anxious, we might get angry at ourselves for that, or we kind of, have experiences of certain thoughts and feelings and then judge those thoughts and feelings as either being good or bad. But this idea of mindful non-judgment is about just allowing any kind of thoughts and feelings and experiences that you have to arise, not labeling them in any particular way, and just kind of letting them be. So that's really what this is capturing.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I was up to here. All right, so as follow-up analysis, we were also interested in whether other psychological factors might perhaps influence the relationship between mindfulness and the AD markers. So what we did was we repeated our PLS analyses, including other psychological factors alongside the mindfulness variables in the first PLS matrix. So we included depression, anxiety, stress, perseverative thinking, as well as the big 5 personality traits. And so 2 key findings came out here. Firstly, we observed that the main relationships between mindfulness and cognitive decline, amyloid and tau, remained significant when these other psychological variables were included in the analyses. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, for the PLS with cognitive decline, which is shown in the top panel, and the PLS for amyloid shown in the bottom panel, mindful non-judgment was the strongest contributing psychological factor to the multivariate relationship. So this really kind of reinforces the importance of mindfulness in the relationship with AD markers, and suggests that this relationship maybe kind of go over and above the relationship with other psychological variables. So to conclude then, we saw that higher levels of trait mindfulness, particularly the non-judgment aspect, were associated with less cognitive decline and less amyloid and tau pathology in the earliest preclinical stage of Alzheimer's disease. So this raises the possibility that perhaps mindfulness might represent a psychological protective factor for Alzheimer's disease. And currently there are multiple international studies ongoing that are examining the potential benefit of mindfulness interventions in early Alzheimer's disease. So these results start to provide some kind of empirical support for the potential benefit of such interventions. So the question then becomes, well, why might mindfulness be protective for Alzheimer's disease? What might be the kind of potential mechanisms that are underlying these relationships? And there can be lots of potential explanations. I don't have time to cover them all in detail, but if anyone wants to discuss further in the Q&A, I'm happy to do so. But firstly, I think most obviously one would hypothesize that mindfulness is related to the AD markers via its impact on reducing psychological distress, so perhaps reducing depression and anxiety, which are known to be risk factors for AD. However, the last analyses I showed there suggest that mindfulness may have some influence on AD risk, perhaps partially independent from these other psychological factors. So it's also possible that people that are more mindful might just be more healthy in general. So they might be getting more sleep, doing more exercise, eating better, things like that. This may then also impact on their cardiovascular risk, which we know is very important for Alzheimer's disease. Mindfulness has also been associated with changes in the structure and the functional connectivity of various brain regions, as I mentioned earlier. Importantly, this includes regions like the default mode network and the medial temporal lobes, and these are also the regions that are crucially implicated in Alzheimer's disease, so there might be some overlap there. There are also a number of biological pathways associated with both mindfulness and AD, so things like physiological stress, inflammation, cellular aging, and so on. But I think in reality, it's probably likely that there's kind of a combination or an interaction between these mechanisms in underlying the relationship between mindfulness and AD risk.
Cherie,
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple of questions related to your study. So first up, we have Julia asking, maybe I missed it, but did you collect information also on whether these participants were actually doing mindfulness on their own? And if so, did you control for it?
We didn't. I think, yeah, that's a really great question. It wasn't something that we thought to ask at the time, but it would be useful to know whether these people that are more mindful in daily life, is it because they have been practicing mindfulness? Have they learned to practice it, or is it just something that they inherently do? We do know that with kind of mindfulness interventions, so teaching people mindfulness meditation and so on, it does change this psychological trait. It does make people kind of more dispositionally mindful. So there do seem to be kind of some interactions between the two. So yeah, I think important for future research to look at how the practice of mindfulness relates with the trait and how this influences AD risk.
All right, next up we have a question from Olivier asking how feasible it is to actually change your trait mindfulness. Is there evidence that any form of training alters individuals' trait scores?
Yeah, so I think I just touched on that actually. So yeah, with mindfulness interventions, and I think even it's been shown in older adults that if you do this kind of, say, 8-week program of learning mindfulness meditation, that if you look at the pre and post scores on this same questionnaire, looking at trait mindfulness, you can see changes in that. So it does seem to be a modifiable trait that we can perhaps alter with intervention.
Thank you.
Okay. So then just some kind of final considerations about this work. Because these associations are just correlations, we of course can't confidently determine the directionality. So it is also possible that reduced mindfulness might be an early symptom of Alzheimer's disease, and this could be an equally interesting observation, I think. We know that evidence from other psychological factors suggests that psychological factors might actually be both a risk factor and an early symptom. So this could also be the case. So it really does stress the importance of performing longitudinal studies, particularly those that involve interventions, so we can determine whether perhaps altering somebody's mindfulness, so altering this trait, does actually change their AD risk factors and markers. Okay, so I was going to pause here at the end of the first project to see if there are any more questions. I know I've answered a few already, but if anyone has anything
we do have a question from Malar.
Okay, sorry, this is really interesting stuff. I do wonder though, so psychological traits are often highly correlated within tests, or across tests, I should say. So how much does this relate to other traits that we know are protective against something like dementia, or are good for healthy aging, like concentration or attention, things which, I know the definitions on those are still out, but would they be highly correlated? And is this at some level a proxy for some of those types of measures that we know a little bit more about?
That's a good question. So I guess we did try to tackle that a little bit with the other psychological measures that we had available, because we do know that mindfulness is related to things like depression, anxiety, and other personality traits. So we tried to address whether it's independent of those factors at least, and our results suggested that it probably at least partially is. In terms of things like attention and concentration, I guess it gets difficult then, because you're kind of, are you then capturing like cognitive changes in attention as a result of early disease, or is it, how do you get at kind of somebody's like trait level attention? I guess we might have to be perhaps looking a bit earlier in the lifespan, but yeah, I think it's definitely important to consider other aspects of psychological functioning that could perhaps be explaining this relationship for sure.
Thanks.
We have another question. So this one from Christine asking, building on that, would you happen to know if mindfulness could help people with ADHD?
Very good question. It's not something that I have particular expertise in, but I would guess that yes, mindfulness is kind of an attention training. It's been shown to help with attentional control, even in older adults who might be starting to show declines in attention. So I would guess that it could be a way to help train attention. I guess it might depend on the severity of the attentional impairment to start with, because obviously engaging in a kind of mindfulness intervention does involve some degree of attention and learning of this new skill. So it might perhaps, depend on the individual severity of that.
Thank you very much. Malar, I see your hand is still raised. Do you have another question? No? Okay, sounds good.
Okay, great. So I'll carry on now to the next project.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt right away. There's the hands raised from Julia. So before you start, maybe we could answer a question.
Sounds good.
Yes, sorry, Cherie. Yeah, I have a question. Do you know if there's any studies looking at cultural differences in these mindfulness traits. I was just thinking, some cultures do implement more like mindfulness practice more than others, and if that has any, influence on even, relationships with pathology, such as, I don't know, Alzheimer's. Yeah. This is exactly what you're talking about.
Really important question. I'm not sure if there's many studies that have specifically addressed cultural differences, but what we do know is this kind of, mindfulness and this new age psychology, it does stem from more like Buddhist traditions originally. So we'd expect that those types of cultures and religious groups would be more mindful than perhaps other populations. I think it's something that I was going to touch on later as well. It is something really important to address as to whether there are kind of cultural or ethnic differences in these relationships, and also when it comes to if we're to perhaps design interventions to attempt to modify some of these traits. I think it's really important to determine how culturally appropriate they might be. And on that topic, some of my colleagues in Australia are doing some really important work looking at designing and adapting mindfulness interventions for Indigenous populations to work with local communities to kind of ensure that these mindfulness programs are going to be something that is feasible and acceptable and culturally appropriate for these individuals, and then kind of determining that initially before they go on to test its effects on things like cognitive function or dementia risks. So yeah, really important point that you raise.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll carry on then. So for this second project, I want to introduce you to another way that we can study risk or protection for Alzheimer's disease that's known as cognitive resilience. So this stems from the observation that around 30% of older adults who are completely cognitively normal during their life, so they don't develop dementia or any kind of cognitive decline, when they die and their brain goes to autopsy, it's actually found to have significant levels of AD pathology in the brain. So these individuals are considered to be cognitively resilient to AD pathology, since they seem to be able to cope with this amyloid and tau in their brain without displaying any kind of cognitive or functional impacts. So this really suggests that there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship between the amount of pathology that we have and the resultant cognitive symptoms. So what we really want to know then is, well, who are these cognitively resilient individuals and how do we be more like them? So certain genetic factors have been associated with cognitive resilience, as well as various aspects of lifestyle, things like increased years of education and so on. But we, of course, are interested in psychological factors that might influence cognitive resilience. And so there have been just a couple of studies, to our knowledge, that are trying to tackle this question. So there is preliminary evidence that certain aspects of personality can be related to cognitive resilience to pathology. So firstly, this study by Teresiano and colleagues in 2013, essentially they had 3 groups of participants. The normal are those who were cognitively normal in life. When they died, they didn't have any Alzheimer's disease pathology. Asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease were those who had Alzheimer's disease pathology in the brain at death, but did not have dementia during life. So these are considered the cognitively resilient individuals. And then the AD group are those who had both dementia and pathology in the brain. So what they found was that this kind of cognitively resilient group, the asymptomatic AD individuals, showed significantly lower levels of neuroticism as well as higher levels of conscientiousness compared with the other groups. Another more recent study by Graham and colleagues, they also were looking at pathology at post-mortem, but this time they were calculating cognitive resilience as more of a continuous measure, so looking at cognitive performance in relation to the amount of pathology. And again, they found significant associations with personality traits. So people with lower levels of neuroticism and high levels of openness showed high levels of cognitive resilience to the Alzheimer's disease pathology in their brain. So this research is kind of still in its preliminary stages, and we think that there are certain methodological updates and new considerations that we might be able to bring along to the field. So firstly, we have at our disposal now these great tools of amyloid and tau PET scanning, which allow us to capture the pathology in life so that we're able to calculate somebody's level of cognitive resilience to pathology while they're still alive without having to wait and look at their brain after they die. We can also draw upon the preclinical phase of the disease, as this may be an ideal opportunity to intervene with perhaps resilience-enhancing interventions. We can use multivariate approaches in order to study various psychological measures in concert rather than separately. And finally, it'll also be useful to understand perhaps the brain mechanisms that might underlie the relationship between psychological factors and cognitive resilience to pathology. So, for example, whether differences in brain structure or brain volume might underlie this relationship. So therefore, for this second project, what we aimed to do was explore various psychological factors that might be associated with cognitive resilience to Alzheimer's disease pathology, again in the earliest preclinical phase of the disease, as well as the potential underlying mechanisms. So again, we drew upon this Prevent AD research cohort of individuals with preclinical Alzheimer's disease. And the way that we calculated cognitive resilience here is by using quite a popular and well-validated technique in the field, which is known as the residuals method. So what this involves is essentially plotting a linear regression model in which you predict cognition based on pathology. And then you take the individual residual values that represent the difference between an individual's actual cognitive performance and their predicted cognitive performance based on their level of pathology. So these residuals then form our measure of cognitive resilience. So, for example, these individuals with the data points shown in green, they have better cognitive performance than what would be predicted based on the amount of pathology in their brain. So these individuals are considered to have high cognitive resilience, whereas the participants shown in red, they have worse cognitive performance than expected based on their pathology. So these individuals are considered to have low cognitive resilience to pathology. And specifically in our cohort, we used global measures of amyloid and entorhinal tau from the PET scans to measure the pathology in vivo. And then for cognition, we took the individual slope values for the Arban's Global Cognitive Index. And then we assess associations between individual differences in cognitive resilience and various different psychological factors. So what we found is, firstly, this shows the univariate associations between various different psychological variables and cognitive resilience. So we found associations between various aspects of positive psychology, as well as neuropsychiatric symptoms and personality traits that related to cognitive resilience. So people that had higher levels of mindful describing, mindful non-judgment, mindful non-reactivity, optimism, and purpose in life, along with lower levels of depression, anxiety, stress, perseverative thinking, and neuroticism, and then higher extroversion and openness. All of these were associated with higher cognitive resilience to Alzheimer's disease pathology. But of course, this is a very long list of associations, and we know that these variables are all highly correlated with one another. So we wanted to kind of simplify this down a little bit in order to perhaps make it a bit more interpretable. So for that, we decided to perform principal components analysis. So again, just to give a very simple overview of this analysis, essentially what we're trying to do with a PCA is to reduce a large number of variables down to a smaller number of representative components. So if we oversimplify it here, let's say that we have 4 of the different psychological variables that are all quite similar to one another. These can all be in a way combined to represent a new component. So the output of PCA includes a matrix which contains all of the newly extracted principal components as your columns, along with the psychological variables as your rows. And then it can tell you the strength as well as the direction of the loadings of each of these variables onto the principal components. So essentially how much these variables are contributing to the principal components. And you can also represent the same information in a plot. So again, showing the strength and the direction of the loading of the different variables onto the extracted principal components. So if we apply a PCA to the psychological variables that were associated with cognitive resilience, 2 main principal components emerge. So the loadings of each of the variables on these new principal components are shown here, but also probably more easily represented in the plot here. So we see on the horizontal axis that the first principal component involved high levels of stress, anxiety, perseverative thinking, neuroticism, and depression, along with lower levels of optimism, mindful non-reactivity, and mindful non-judgment. So if we were to kind of apply a bit of a label to this principal component, we might consider it to represent something like emotional regulation. And then our second principal component shown on the vertical axis, this time involves things like high levels of extroversion, mindful describing, openness, and purpose in life. So these can all be considered to represent perhaps approach behaviours or kind of seeking out experiences and relationships. But essentially we found 2 main principal components that were of psychological factors that were related to cognitive resilience to pathology. So then as a next step, in order to start to determine what might be some of the mechanisms underlying this relationship, we explored the associations between these principal components and patterns of grey matter volume across the whole brain using voxel-based morphometry. So what we found here was distinct patterns of grey matter volume to be related to each of the principal components. And these quite nicely recapitulate the known brain regions implicated in these different psychological processes. So for the first principal component, we found associations with regions including the medial prefrontal and orbitofrontal cortex, the medial and lateral parietal lobes, as well as the insula, particularly on the right. Whereas for the second principal component, we found kind of more circumscribed associations with grey matter in the posterior hippocampus bilaterally, as well as in the precuneus. And importantly, these 2 principal components seem to overlap in their association with grey matter, particularly in the posterior cingulate region, which is important because we know that this is a really crucial brain region that becomes abnormal in early stages of Alzheimer's disease. So then to kind of round out this analysis, what we wanted to know was whether these grey matter patterns might perhaps help explain the relationship between the psychological factors and cognitive resilience. So for this, we performed a mediation model looking at the potential mediating effect of grey matter on the relationship between the the two psychological principal components and cognitive resilience. So we perform this separately for each of the principal components. And what we found was that for both of them, grey matter volume partially mediated the relationship between psychology and cognitive resilience. So to kind of break that down a little bit, we found that the relationship between psychological factors and cognitive resilience still remains significant when we controlled for grey matter volume, but the strength of that relationship did significantly decrease when we applied bootstrapping to that difference. So to conclude, what we found was two main dimensions of psychological functioning that were associated with cognitive resilience to Alzheimer's disease pathology in the preclinical phase of the disease. So these were specifically emotional regulation and approach behaviours. And it's possible that these may, at least in part, exert their protective effect by increased grey matter volume. So we can hypothesise that perhaps increased psychological wellbeing may be associated with increased grey matter volume, which in turn then renders people more able to cope with Alzheimer's disease pathology in their brain, or gives them more cognitive resilience. Okay, so just to take a bit of a step back now and consider, well, why do we care about these psychological factors? What's the relevance? So something really important to note is that we know that up to 40% of the risk for dementia is attributable to modifiable factors. And in the absence of any current cure or successful treatment for Alzheimer's disease, if we kind of target our attention towards these modifiable risk factors, we do have the potential to prevent potentially millions of cases of dementia. So we do consider these psychological factors to fall under the umbrella of modifiable risk factors. I kind of alluded to this earlier with mindfulness, but there's also evidence for some of the other psychological traits that they can be modifiable with various forms of intervention and education. So to give a couple of examples, this study here was looking at the effects of an intervention designed to improve trait optimism. So we can see that with the intervention, the levels of optimism significantly increased over the course of the study compared with the control group. But perhaps a bit more strikingly, this meta-analysis conducted by Roberts and colleagues was looking at changes in various personality traits as a result of interventions. And what they found was particularly for the trait of emotional stability. So this is another word for neuroticism. They found really quite significant impacts of intervention on change in this trait. So really suggests there is some potential for these traits to be modifiable. So I think before we can really translate some of these findings into the clinic or into kind of dementia risk guidelines, there are still some remaining questions that we need to address. Firstly, if we change psychological wellbeing, can we then alter someone's risk for Alzheimer's disease? So at the moment, we've just shown associations with the markers, but if we actually intervene and alter these factors, does that then result in a change in some of the markers of AD? And if so, at what point in the lifespan do we need to act? So is it sufficient just to be delivering these interventions in older adults who might be close to the kind of disease onset, or do we really need to be acting much further in the lifespan, perhaps before these traits become a bit more enduring or stable? So then looking ahead, I'll just quickly go through these. Just a few kind of considerations for future research in the field. It's becoming increasingly popular to employ multi-domain interventions for dementia prevention that combine multiple aspects of behaviour into the one intervention rather than studying them separately. And I think there's a lot of potential for psychological interventions to be perhaps layered onto these other aspects of behaviour to maybe boost their efficacy. Despite the fact that we consider 60% of the dementia risk to be non-modifiable or attributable to genetic factors, there may be possibilities to ameliorate one's genetic risk by changing behaviour. So it'd be important to explore these potential interactions a bit further. There's also been huge developments over the past, particularly just the past few years, in the advent of plasma biomarkers for AD pathology, so measuring amyloid and tau in the blood. And I think these have potential to be a really kind of easily accessible and cheaper way of tracking the success of interventions for AD risk rather than using the more expensive PET scans. Finally, going back to the point raised by Julia, highly important to be considering the backgrounds of our populations that we study and ensuring we are capturing a diverse range of individuals when we look at these associations and determining whether any kind of cultural or ethnic factors, linguistic factors may be impacting on them as well when we are designing interventions, something very important to keep in mind. So at the start of my talk, the title was posing this question of whether you can think your way out of dementia. So I think based on the results that I was showing today, I would answer maybe. We clearly do need more studies, but the initial evidence is quite promising. And I think most importantly, the benefits of improving one's psychological wellbeing are obviously far more wide-reaching than just affecting Alzheimer's disease risk, along with kind of minimal risk associated with such improvements. So I think it is something that can be worthy of our attention. So thank you for your attention, again, for the invitation to present today. Particularly thanks to everyone in the lab, including Dr. Villeneuve and other lab members, the participants and study centre that Prevent AD, as well as my funding sources as well. I'm happy to take any further questions.
Thank you, Cherie. That was an amazing talk, as always. It was so interesting. And I mean, we're in the same lab, but I didn't see some of those results. So it was nice to see like those results. So do we have any questions from the audience? You can feel free to raise your hands or ask them in the chat. In the meantime, while they're coming in, maybe I can ask, I did wrote down a few questions, so maybe I can ask one. Yeah. So more specifically for your residual method for amyloid and tau to look at the cognitive resilience, were amyloid and tau included in the same models, or did you establish cognitive resilience separately for each marker?
Yeah, so for the results I presented, they were included in the same model. This is something that's quite frequently done in the literature to really, because we know that amyloid and tau kind of have this synergistic effect on cognition. So we want to look at their combined effect rather than necessarily their separate ones. So they were included together along with covariates of things like age and sex. I did also check what it would look like if they were just addressed separately, and the results are fairly similar. I think, as we'd expect, that the results were probably stronger for tau, because we know that tau is more closely associated with the clinical symptoms. But yeah, there wasn't any kind of striking difference necessarily when I looked at them separately. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you beat me to my follow-up questions, which was like, what if we looked at them separately?
Yeah.
All right. Otherwise, questions, don't hesitate. And otherwise, I'll just ask maybe one other while I'm there. So like in your second study, you showed like those principal components of like a mix of behavioral factors. And then you say that, yeah, we should intervene on behavioral factors as a whole instead of just one trait or the other. So when we look at, let's say, clinicians who are more restricted in time for interventions, which do we choose? Because I guess it's not always possible to do more of a broader intervention when we can intervene on all of them at once. So how do we go ahead and choose which one we should target?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think part of, the aim of doing this PCA was to attempt to find something common that might be underlying these different psychological factors, since they are so related, and we don't really want to just treat them all separately. Since it was just a principal components analysis, it wasn't a factor analysis, we can't confidently determine that there is some kind of underlying factor like, emotional regulation or like approach behaviours that is producing these different aspects. But I think we can delve into that a little bit more, and this does give initial indications that there might be something like those factors that do tie everything together and represent the kind of a common factor between them that can be targeted in intervention. So just, developing something that targets emotion regulation broadly, as opposed to its various aspects.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll stop the main presentation here, but I think Cherie has agreed to stay behind for a student discussion. So anyone who wants to stay and ask questions, you're free to stay around. And then otherwise, thank you so much for your talk.
Thanks a lot.
Great work, Cherie. Very nice work.
Thanks for having me.